And a very warm welcome to Winter Tales and the last of our events for today. We've got plenty more over the weekend, so please do look at the programme and sign up for more on Saturday and Sunday. So I'm Helen Bond. I'm Professor of Christian Origins here and also Head of the School of Divinity. And I'm very much looking forward to our talk this evening. But just before we get into things, I've got some health and safety announcements. So those of you who've been at some events already will be getting pretty sick of this list, but I need to go through it anyway. So first of all, masks are required to be worn at all times. So please do wear your mask unless you're exempt. We're okay because we're up here talking, but everybody else needs to keep them on. We've got your details for the track and trace, so we do have everybody's details if you signed up on the Eventbrite form, so that's what we've got all those details for. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if you do hear a continuous alarm, then please get out of the building in an orderly fashion. There's plenty of people around to direct you to the nearest fire escape. And just generally maintain a safe distance between everybody else. Particularly when we're leaving the building, we'll go out that way, and there are helpers around to make sure that you know which way to go, because it is a bit of a maze, this place. So that's all the health and safety, and now down to the main thing for this evening. I'm delighted to introduce my guest. Charles Foster is a man of many talents. He's a writer, a barrister, a traveller, and a vet. And as you'd expect from somebody with that kind of background, he has many interests, from evolutionary biology to anthropology, from medical ethics to philosophy, and of course theology, and the bigger questions of life. What on earth are we all doing here? He's currently Fellow of Green Templeton College in Oxford, and he's the author of several books. The two that I think we're going to be talking about mostly tonight are his, I think, two most recent ones. One is Being a Beast from 2016. You can see it up on the screen up there too. It's an incredible account of Charles's time living in the wild as a badger, an otter, a deer, a fox, and a bird. And I can't wait to hear about some of your adventures there. The second one is Being a Human from 2021. And I suppose this in some ways is an extension of that. It's living in the wild as yet another creature, but this time he takes a more sweeping view of a sort of sweepingly historical survey of humans since the Paleolithic. So very interesting books. And Charles, you are very welcome here tonight. To start us off, I wondered if you could maybe tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write these books and what were the guiding questions?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Wonderful to be here. What inspired me to write Being a Beast was this. I wondered if it was possible to know anything at all about anything other than the contents of my own head. So my own head is an echoing, lonely place, and I wanted to know if it was possible to have a real conversation with anybody that wasn't at cross purposes. And I thought, if I can have even the tiniest indication of what it's like to occupy the sensory world of a badger or a fox, then maybe I can have a conversation with my children or my best friends. So it was an attempt to see how accessible otherness was. So that was Being a Beast. And why write Being a Human? Because I have no idea what sort of creature I am. And if I have no idea what sort of creature I am, then it's quite difficult to know how to be a decent father or friend. It's quite difficult to know how I should act. It's quite difficult to know what makes me thrive. And I thought I ought to have a go at trying to find out what I am while I'm still here and in a position to discover that.
And what did you discover?
I discovered that in order to decide what I am, we've got to go back a long way into our evolutionary history and retrace our steps. And so I tried to occupy immersively, as I did in Being a Beast, three pivotal moments in the history, the evolution of modern humans. So the Upper Paleolithic, about 40,000 years or so ago, then the Neolithic, when we became farmers, when we became sedentary, when our previous intimate relationship with the natural world, where we bled into it and it bled into us, was ruptured, where we started to build walls across the land, walls across our own minds. And then I jumped to the Enlightenment, the ironically named Enlightenment, which was a time of disenchantment. Maybe we'll come on to that. But what did I discover? I discovered that we are quintessentially relational creatures, that it makes no sense to try to describe who Charles Foster is just by saying, this is the set of his attributes. I have to describe myself in terms of the nexus of relationships of which I am a part. Take away that nexus, and I'm not just miserable and lonely, although I am, I evaporate. I'm a quintessentially relational creature, and some of those relationships which define me are relationships with the non-human world as well. I discovered, I think, that I am an ensouled creature, and that bad stuff happens when we start to assert for ourselves and also for the non-human world that we are non-souled creatures.
So to go, I think it's really interesting what you say about relational creatures. I mean, one of the things that struck me most when I was reading Being a Human was that family and relationships come up a lot, and particularly, I think, fathers and sons. So in the Upper Paleolithic, you have this sort of shadowy father called X, who appears with his son sometimes, and then in the Neolithic as well, there's this man with the badger fur boots, which I think was just a lovely image, and he has again a shadowy son with him, and of course in the wood, you go into the woods and you're there with your own teenage son.
Yeah.
And I thought, so I mean, would you say that this whole idea about sort of relationships is the essence of what makes a human? Is this the most important thing?
Without any question at all. So we are relational animals, and because we are relational animals, we are able to tell stories which make sense. So we are storytelling creatures, and stories which are monologues are not proper stories. So we have to have other actors in our drama in order to make sense of what we are. And I went into the wood with my son, always, because, as we were just discussing, Charles Foster without his relationships just isn't Charles Foster. And I also went into the wood with my son because I'm actually quite keen on my son, but also he's a fantastic research tool. So he has the glorious gift of dyslexia. If I look at a tree, I get some visual images from that tree, and I translate those visual images into something which is nothing like the tree at all. Into remembered fragments of poems about the tree, remembered physiological facts about trees. So I've never seen a tree, and that is unfortunate because I suspect, although of course I can't know, that a tree is far more colourful and charismatic than my thoughts about it. So I reduce everything in the world, and I'm reducing everything in this lecture theatre now to a set of numbered, linguistically framed propositions about the world, which have only this shadowy relationship to what's out there, I suspect. Tom isn't like that. Tom has seen trees. Because he doesn't have my linguistic reductionism at the core of what he is, he sees trees without reducing them to his self-referential and self-reverential thoughts. So being in the wood with Tom is a better way of finding out what the wood is like than being in a wood with Charles Foster alone. Yeah.
And what about dead people? That was something that struck me in the book too, that you seem almost haunted by dead people sometimes, and there's quite a lot about what we do with dead people. You know, in the modern world, we tend to sort of put them away somewhere where they're out of sight, whereas
in a municipal crematorium across the ring road. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I think there's quite a lot of times in the book where you suggest that actually having the dead with us, having the bones under the floorboard or on the mantelpiece. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that, your sort of views on how the living and the dead almost sort of function together.
Yeah. So, both in the Upper Paleolithic and the Neolithic, there was an abiding and defining sense that the dead were always there. And in the Upper Paleolithic particularly, the agency of the dead increased. They had gone over to another world. That was probably the world into which the shamans shuffled when they went on their voyages across the actual or metaphorical cave wall. They there communed with spirit animals, and they communed also with the human dead. And because the human dead were over the other side of that membrane, a membrane across which great gifts were to be found, the dead, if they were appeased and communicated with all the time, could help in bringing the herds to be killed at the right time, could give the tribe, just as spirit animals would give them, an idea of where the berries were to be found in a particular season. It was a special example of the conviction that everything in the world, whether human or not, was full of agency. And in exactly the same spirit, they would believe, as it is convenient from a number of perspectives for us to believe, that there is a spirit or a soul sitting inside the animal whose buttocks we eat when we have our burger or whatever. So that whole attitude towards the human dead, which was a special example of an assertion of the belief of the agency of everything, infused their whole world and imbued them with a respect for absolutely everything, which gave their lives a dignity. If you're going to kill something in order to eat it, you have, if it's an ensouled thing, to embark on an elaborate liturgy, a choreography of oblation and satisfaction, which will ensure that you're not haunted by that thing. And that seems to me to be a practice which would reduce lots of the toxicity of our modern orientation towards the world.
So I'm wondering, for people who haven't read the book, whether it might be useful just to sort of give an overview, because you see that as a sort of a golden age, it seems to me, that the Paleolithic, that was a time when people were sort of really human, where you could sort of live authentically as a human. And then you think that things all went wrong in sort of the Neolithic, or had they already started to go wrong in the Paleolithic already? But they certainly went wrong in the Enlightenment. So yeah. It might be interesting, I think, just to give a bit more outline of the thesis of the book.
Yeah. So in the Paleolithic, we were creatures who saw ourselves, as we've been discussing, as having very porous membranes. So the distinction between you and me was not clear. The distinction between me as a hunter and the caribou which I was going to kill was not clear. There was a much more holistic, rather modern ecological understanding of how everything was crucially held together. There was also in the Upper Paleolithic, as we've discussed already, this sense that there was a lot of traffic between this dimension and other dimensions. So we now know that human neural networks can operate in 11 dimensions. We choose to use only 4 of those dimensions, 3 spatial dimensions and time. So we're wired up for a lot more than we normally realize that we are. And I think that in the Upper Paleolithic, from what we can reconstruct from the cave paintings and from burial practice and so on, they operated in rather more of those dimensions than we operated in. And that probably means that they lived a lot more intensely than we do. They certainly use their ordinary senses, as hunters have to do in a much more complete way than we do. So we have at least 5 senses. Didn't Aquinas say we have 11, something like that? But we have at least 5 senses. We choose to use only one of those, our sight. And our sight is tied up with our cognition and therefore gets very distorted. But if we choose to use, as we do choose to use, just 20% of the available data that floods into our sensory receptors, it's not surprising that we get things wrong. Just imagine what it would be like if we made decisions about our business or our relationships on the basis of a fifth of the available information. We would be bankrupt and our relationships would be disastrous. Yet that's what we are doing as modern humans about the whole world. So our epistemology is to cock. And I suspect that in the Upper Paleolithic, they had a more satisfactory epistemology simply because they were more sensorially switched on. And I think that they were occupying rather more of the dimensions which we are wired up for than we occupy now. So I do see it as something of a golden age, to use your expression. They were also wanderers. They walked. When we stop walking, stuff goes wrong. When red blood cells stop going through our coronary arteries, we die. We stopped as a species in the Neolithic when we decided, for convenience's sake, that instead of hunting the herds across hundreds of miles, we wanted to kill and eat the animals in our backyard. And stuff started to go wrong. So we imprisoned those creatures, but more than imprisoning the creatures, we imprisoned ourselves. We tied ourselves down to a tiny number of species, both plant and animal, and putting our eggs almost literally in one basket was a very dangerous thing to do. It meant that we were more vulnerable to zoonoses. Population grew, but it meant that epidemic disease rushed through the population. But more sinister than that were the sociological things which happened. So if you create a surplus, you create hierarchy. You create people who have a bit of the surplus and people who don't. You create a system which is ruled by the law of supply and demand, rather than by the law of oblation and satisfaction and gratitude. If your harvest fails, what more natural than to pick up your flint-tipped spear and go across to the next valley in order to take the harvest from your neighbours who've had a better one. So whatever Steven Pinker says, real tectonic human-on-human violence erupted for the first time in the Upper Paleolithic. With this status which comes with supply and demand came distinctions between men and women. It was possible for men to say, oh, we're out in the fields doing the real stuff. The women are sitting there grinding the corn, and therefore their role in the business of existing isn't as significant. So that was not good. That was not good. So that was the Neolithic. And then the Enlightenment. So up until the Enlightenment, there had always been an understanding that the universe was an organism. It was then reconceived in the Enlightenment as a machine. From Aristotle onwards, everything, humans, animals, plants, had been seen as having souls. If the universe is reconceived as a machine, there's no place in a machine for a soul. If the universe is reconceived as a machine, some moral consequences follow, because it's not obviously wrong to smash up a machine. It's rather more ethically dodgy to kill an ensouled creature. And from those first moves, which were started by Descartes, I think, came the notion that there is only matter. Notwithstanding the fact that we've no idea what matter is. Anyway, we maybe get onto that.
Can I take you back to the differences between men and women, which I did find very interesting, and your idea that this really sort of the difficulties between men and women perhaps came, or the hierarchy, the patriarchy, came in the Neolithic, and it did seem to me in the Paleolithic area. Surely when you have hunter-gatherers, I mean, I can't imagine that a hunter-gatherer, a male hunter comes home, and I think in the book you suggest that sort of gathering is also very important. So what the woman is doing in terms of gathering is equally important as what the man's doing in terms of hunting. But I can't really imagine that a hunter, even if he only goes hunting every fortnight or month, surely he's going to come back home and he's the big man, and whatever the woman is doing in terms of daily gathering is. I mean, I just thought perhaps you were a little romantic in your views sometimes in the Paleolithic.
The first point to make is that I see romantic as a great compliment.
I'm not necessarily saying it's bad.
But the anthropological orthodoxy is that hunter-gatherers, by and large, are more egalitarian than sedentary communities. That is a very broad generalization, and if one accepts that hunter-gatherer communities, particularly in the Upper Paleolithic, took their cue from the natural world, which is one of the basic axioms of understanding that age, then I do think one has to concede there's something in your point that the hunting men see themselves as the antlered stags who lorded over the hinds as well as the less well-antlered stags. But that said, you made the more important point yourself, which is that berries are more important than meat for most hunter-gatherer communities. But I do think that the egalitarianism of hunter-gatherer communities has probably been exaggerated. If we look at modern hunter-gatherer communities in the Pacific Midwest, for example, they are pretty egalitarian for about 9 months of the year. That's when they're wandering. That's when all the dialectic that we've just been discussing comes into play. And then they come together, usually in midwinter, for 3 months of feasting, sex, and politics. They talk, they copulate, and at that point, for those 3 months, you see those old Neolithic hierarchies that continue to bedevil us. You see laws, you see police forces, which then dissipate at the end of the 3 months. So it may be that if Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers followed that model, they knew about hierarchy from their 3 months of feasting, but they chose not to live that way for the rest of the time. And one of the consistent observations that's made about the abandonment of hunter-gatherer life and the taking up of sedentary life is that it's done usually only at a whip end. People who are hunter-gatherers don't like to stop being hunter-gatherers. They're usually pushed into it by, for example, the need to buy brides in cattle, which is how the transition often happens in southern Africa. But we like to think that sedentary life, because that's what we adopt, is what all right-thinking people have always opted for if they've had the choice. Not so. People only become like us when they've got no option. And we were pushed into becoming like us, probably as a result of climate change in the Upper Dryas about 14,000 years ago in the Near East. So we are the way we are because we were pushed into being this way.
And wandering comes up a lot. I mean, I see that wandering is a very positive thing for you. And it was interesting when I was looking at your website that you do a lot of traveling yourself. And do you see a link between that? I mean, I understand you've crossed the Sahara in disguise, and you've tracked Noah's Ark, and as we've seen already, you've lived as a badger in various suburban gardens. So I mean, exploration and travel and wandering seems to be sort of very deep inside you as well. Do you sort of see that as in some ways sort of getting at your humanity?
I do think that wandering is of the essence of what we are. So Bruce Chapman is, of course, the great chronicler of this. And I have always been unhappy and dysfunctional and an even worse friend and father and husband than I normally am if I've been tied down to one place. But I also have a very short attention span. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So can I ask you a little bit more about your family, particularly Tom, the son that you take into the woods? What does he make of this?
He doesn't know what all the fuss is about.
Just seems normal.
I mean, normal human children spend most of their childhood up trees or as quadrupeds crawling around on the floor, eating invertebrates. And it's really a very pathological state of childhood, isn't it? That has any other way of being a child. So a general point is that when people accuse me of being weird, in, for example, trying to live like a badger did, or trying to work out what it was like to live in the Upper Paleolithic, the self-defensive response, but which I think is the historically accurate response is, you're the weird one. You know, the really weird thing to do is to sit on a sofa and look at a screen, or work every day sitting down in an air-conditioned office. Now, that's the deeply eccentric human behavior. Almost no humans over the course of our history as a species have done that. And it's deadly. So the really normative things are worm eating and badger emulation and tree climbing. And because Tom is still a child, he's not forgotten that that's how human beings are meant to be.
And so what do you learn from him?
Most of what I know about being a human. So he's taught me how to escape from the tyranny of language. He's taught me how to revive my long forgotten senses. Plato talked about knowledge as anamnesis, unforgetting. That's the whole of knowledge. And children, and particularly Tom, because of his fantastic dyslexia, has forgotten less than most of us. So being in his company can help me to unforget.
One thing I wasn't sure about in the book was he has a whistle, and you finish the book with his whistle. What was the significance of the whistle?
So the whistle is, I'm afraid, an artistic device, which is supposed to hint that he was clairvoyantly connected with these hunter-gatherer people who he and I see mistily appearing in the wood and at various other places. I think he was clairvoyantly connected, but I don't think it manifested itself in a whistle. But that was the idea of that device.
Right. As this is a religious book festival, I'd love to hear something about your own spiritual journey and how you think that informed your writing. I understand you've been attracted by various spiritual identities over the years.
Yeah.
If I can put it that way.
Yeah. So I'm Greek Orthodox, and the journey to Greek Orthodox was a long and very tortuous one, which started as a Yorkshire child with the sort of animism, which I think most children inherit, which then became, first of all, crystallized and then sclerosed into a kind of evangelicalism, which now seems very alien to me. And I escaped from that branch of evangelicalism into charismatic evangelicalism, which allowed me for the first time to acknowledge the emotional parts of me which had been brutally suppressed by an English public school. And then, to cut a very long story short, that way of perceiving the world didn't seem to have sufficient explanatory power, and so I gave it all up. And I converted to Judaism, really because I felt that I had to start right at the beginning and work out if there was any truth to the Judeo-Christian story from scratch. And after a long time and a lot of quite traumatic experiences, both for me and my family, in that phase, I found it impossible to continue to sideline the claims of Jesus, and I found my way back into orthodoxy, Greek orthodoxy, and that was because of my concern about origins, really. It seemed to me to be the least contaminated by the political currents which have happened in Western Christianity over the last 2,000 years or so. Because for quite a lot of its time, of course, orthodoxy has been penned behind various walls, which have rendered it to some extent immune from those political currents. So that was part of it. Another part of it was, this does relate to the conversation we're having about being Paleolithic, was Orthodoxy's insistence on the importance of immanence as well as transcendence. So Greek Orthodox start the morning by saying, Holy Spirit, present in all places and filling all things. And that includes the bodies of badgers, and it includes the stems of plants, and it includes mountaintop sanctuaries. And it did seem to me that quite a lot of what I had rejected in the previous iterations of Christianity which I'd experienced was an overemphasis on the transcendental, on the vertical dimension of Christianity. And as I looked in the Gospels, and as I looked in the early church fathers, and as I looked, crucially, in my own experience, it seemed to me that orthodoxy was asserting something about the ensouledness of the world, which I had found to be true myself, and which I needed to affirm in order to give the natural world, which was so important to me, the respect which I had for it. And I was hugely surprised to find immanence being so unapologetically asserted. I'd assumed that was the province of shamans and animists, and I was relieved to find that there was a specifically Christian language for all those intuitions which were so important to me.
Mm-hmm. And does it make sense to you to talk about an afterlife? And if so, what would it be like?
It makes crucial sense to me. So I see there, I think, that consciousness is a quality which is ubiquitous in the universe. So the electrons in that piece of carpet over there have at least a rudimentary consciousness. That consciousness is different in degree, certainly, from the consciousness which I call my own, but it's probably not all that different in nature. What determines the way that our consciousness behaves is the way in which it relates to matter. So an organism like me is what happens when a bit of universal consciousness, God consciousness, call it what you like, collides with and becomes enfolded in the matter which composes this body. And once it's taken the shape of my body, this bit of consciousness continues to hold the shape which this body has, or at least which this personality has. And because I'm a mind-body-spirit unity, my spirit and my body have some important and enduring relationship to one another. All of which is a long-winded way of saying that when the consciousness leaves this particular body, it continues to have stamped on it that which is quintessentially Charles Foster. There will be a sense in which it returns to a universal consciousness, but not in the Buddhist sense of being diluted entirely out of existence. Quite the opposite. It becomes more itself as a result of being part of that wider community of consciousnesses. It goes back to what we were saying earlier, I guess, that the more relational I am, the more I am myself. It's not that I get diluted into some anemic shadow of myself, still less that I cease to exist by becoming more relational. So I think something like that is what I believe about the afterlife, and I'm encouraged in that the second part of that explanation by my reading of the nature of the resurrection body of Jesus. So it's more solid than mine. It can walk through walls. It can appear to different people at the same time. So the resurrected Charles Foster in the resurrection body will be supramaterial and far more himself than you see him now.
So the book, as you've already said, says a lot about the relationship between humans and the natural world. And you hint very, very briefly, I think, at the modern climate emergency. But I wondered if you had any suggestions as to ways we might live more harmoniously with nature.
I think the fundamental thing is the acknowledgement of our interconnectedness with everything else. So if we take on board the basic Darwinian fact, which we were told by Darwin 150 years ago, that only a few pages back in the family album, all our relatives are furred and scaly and finned, that will make it impossible to treat the natural world with the frankly psychopathic approach that we normally do. So that orientation, the interconnectedness orientation, and then going out and being in it. So we only kill with the sort of callousness which has come to characterize us, that which we don't know. So going out and stroking a ladybird, or looking into the eyes of your dog and realizing that it is trying to connect with you in exactly the same way that you're trying to connect with it. Also, we need to cultivate a different kind of attention to the world, a sort of attention which insists that the atomistic picture of ourselves as hard, carapaced beings is ecologically fatuous and psychologically harmful. There are various ways of corroding away that carapace. Mindfulness meditation is just one of those. But I'm no expert on these things. I'm no guru. I just go out and sit in woods with my son without coming to any great conclusions about what the world should do.
I mean, you say you told us you're Greek Orthodox, and I've read elsewhere that you're very interested in ancient Greek civilization. The ancients didn't really make it into your book very much. I think you have a little bit on the ancient Egyptians, but do you think that ancient civilizations have things to teach us today?
Well, absolutely, and there would have been a very good case for including the Axial Age. As one of these pivotal moments, alongside the three that I did deal with, the time when all the great world religions, or many of them, erupted. The reason I didn't do that was because it seemed to me that what was happening in that time was an evolution of ideas which had already bubbled up into the world. So we see a number of different iterations of ways of being in the world, which had been forged in the Neolithic and before that in the Upper Paleolithic. It didn't seem to me that anything really tectonic was being done then. We had some new and copious and sophisticated footnotes to what had gone before, but nothing really terribly new. So, for example, to take your mention of ancient Egypt up, ancient Egyptian religion, it would seem to me is something which is a pretty clear development from the sort of shamanism which we see on the caves of Lascaux. We see those therianthropes, human-animal hybrids, and I have always presumed that those gods were doing the same thing, namely mediating between worlds in precisely the same way, or nearly the same way, that Upper Paleolithic and other hunter-gatherer shamans were doing. So, yes, a good deal could and should have been said about those other ages, but it didn't seem to me that they were as formative as the ages that I looked at. The memes of my own mind are almost entirely Greek, as I'm coming to realize. And that was the specific reason for not writing about the Greeks, because the whole purpose of being a human project was to get out of my own mind. And writing about the Greeks would have been an intellectual autobiography, which would have defeated the whole purpose of this project.
Right, I see. So, I mean, one of the things that strikes me, I think, most about this book is just how interdisciplinary it is. You know, in universities, we're always being told we have to be interdisciplinary, and sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. But I think what really struck me about it is you're drawing on so many different aspects, and maybe that's part of what you have to do if you're talking about something like being a human, because it does impinge on so many different things. But is this something that you're just naturally drawn to? You're just somebody who does like to sort of have, to bring into conversation all sorts of different disciplines?
Well, I've already admitted to you I have a very short attention span. But I think human beings are absolutely amazing creatures. And in order to understand these amazing creatures, or even to begin the hubristic exercise of trying to answer the question, what is a human? Yes, you've got to draw on every field that has been described, and very many more. So the very end of the book is a discussion of the Enlightenment, and most of it is about some of the great discoveries in quantum physics over the last 75 years or so. Because it seemed to me that what is being revealed about the nature of entanglement by experiments in the Hadron Collider told us a very great deal about how we should entangle with one another in our kitchens and our bedrooms. So we are meant as humans to occupy this universe in a far more intense and intimate way than we do. And if we do that properly, our kitchen table discourse will be about electron spin as well as about caribou hunting. So if we're taking ourselves sufficiently seriously and our engagement with the world is as intimate as it should be, there should be no holds barred. And we should use all the tools that we possibly can in order to try to crack open the great secret of what being a human is.
Mm-hmm. So we've got 10 minutes or so I'm going to open it to the floor to see if anybody has any questions that they would like to put to Charles. Got 10 minutes or so, and then we can just wrap things up. James in the front.
Hi, yes, thank you for a wonderful talk. I have so many questions, but I'll choose the first one that came to me. There's a tension in being a human where you're talking about the Neolithic, and you're sort of talking about the desire for comfort in the Neolithic turn, but then you have your friends who live on the very small farm who sort of rebuke you and say, there's no comfort in this lifestyle. It's terrifying. This is a scary lifestyle. And I just wonder whether you think that that's actually, like, they both can be true, in the sense that it's a lifestyle that fundamentally is scary, because as you said, you've thrown all your eggs in one basket. You've sort of cut yourself off from the natural liturgy. But it's in this sort of pursuit of comfort that you're never gonna get rid of the scared part of it. So do you see, I guess, that the root of the sort of Neolithic desire you talk about to dominate, to conquer, to thing, could really be just this heightened sense of fear and a never satiated comfort?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind words. Yes, I think a lot of what happened in the Neolithic was a direct result of fear. And I think that is very well demonstrated if one looks at the Natufian culture in the borders of modern Syria and Palestine about 14,000 years ago. You had there hunter-gatherers who were also sedentary. You had people who had the best of all worlds. And then the climate changed, and they were forced to abandon this Eden-like world in which they both hunted caribou and cut cereals with their flint sickles. they were driven by climate change into two streams. Some of them went back to becoming hunter-gatherers, but hunter-gatherers in places where it just wasn't very good to hunt and gather, because there weren't the great herds of gazelle which the Natufians had preyed on. And they were sedentary, but not in places which gave the great yields which they had on the coast of Syria. And then the climate changed again, and it was possible to go back to the old places. But because of the tremendous ontological vertigo, which I think that they had experienced in these two uncomfortable streams, whether they opted for the hunter-gatherer or the sedentary stream, because of that vertigo, they settled down in Jericho and were thereafter ruled by a much more intense sense, I think, of the contingencies which affected them. As Natufians, they hadn't been affected by those contingencies. So I think we see in what's described as the first village, the Jericho region, a clustering together and a development of religious thoughts about the world which were designed to keep out the unpleasant uncertainties which had bedeviled the dispossessed Natufians. And that became defining of Neolithic culture and has become entirely defining of ours.
How do we overcome that fear that we inherit?
We can become religious, we can become mindful. Easier said than done.
Thank you.
Any other questions? This one over there. Emma.
Thank you very much. I was wondering why, in your project of looking into what it is to being a human, you took a historic view, when across the globe there are many people's groups who, to a greater or lesser extent, still live in a very, very close relation to nature, as you've described.
That's a very good question. I have some experience of modern hunter-gatherer groups, particularly in West Papua, so what was Irian Jaya. And I've travelled with some of those people and know a little bit about how they work. And I have some experience of modern Neolithic people living in various settlements in Europe. But the reason that I didn't think I could rely entirely on experiences of modern hunter-gatherer communities was because of what the archaeologists and the anthropologists told me about the likely differences between the way they lived and the way that Upper Paleolithic people did. One cannot draw easy inferences from modern hunter-gathering to what made us what we are. That's the simple answer. Yeah. Well, it was originally my plan to do exactly as you said, and I had lots and lots of dismissive conversations with anthropologists who said that was illegitimate.
Any other questions? Oh, Carolina.
Sorry. I have just one question. You've been analyzing and like the relation between us and nature, but what are your ideas about the artificial life, like the artificial world? Do you think that in the future machines, artificial intelligence can help us regain this that was lost from the golden age, or did you see it as a complete catastrophe?
I find it difficult to understand how the primary product of the problem can be the solution, is the short answer.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, one there.
Hello. It's great to be here. Really enjoy being a beast,
Thank
and we've had lots of chat about it in our circles, and it reminded me greatly of that sense of being a child, being out in the wild, and that lack of division between oneself and the natural surrounding. And clearly here we all are as adults, yourself included, maybe in professional life, the artificial life, and then how do you yourself manage that tension of having to circulate in this sort of environment, but knowing there's a part of yourself that really feels it's all quite alien, and that we want to be out there snuffling around type thing?
Thank you very much.
Does that make any sense at all?
Thank you. The American naturalist and philosopher David Abraham said that there are only relatively unwild places. So this is a wild place. You are a wild animal. Inside my gut, there are billions of bacteria and fungi over which I have no control, which are completely wild things. But if they weren't there, I would be dead. If the electrical impulses going through my heart were just a little bit wilder than they are, I would drop dead in front of you. A shopping mall is a wild place. If you leave a banana out in a shopping mall for a few days, you come back, however pristine the shopping mall is, and it will be covered with glorious efflorescence of bacteria and fungi. So that is what I constantly try to remind myself of as I'm pacing misanthropically down a shopping mall. I'm all too aware all the time of my own shaggy atavism. Now, I don't have to be specifically reminded of that. But the contingencies which we think of as particularly modern are really just very minor variations on the ones which affected the way that hunter-gatherers worked. And when I reflect on those contingencies, I do specifically try to say, yes, but that's not all that different from what happens if a caribou turns on you. Yeah.
Well, it's just about 10 o'clock. So thank you so much, Charles Foster. I think this has been really, really interesting. And I'm sure people, if they haven't read the books, will want to go and remember that you can buy them. I think the bookshop is probably shut now. Oh, no, it's still open. It's still open. So you can still buy them just now. Or if you come back, which I hope you will, on Saturday or Sunday, you can buy them there. But Jolyon is signing to me that if you go and buy it just now, Charles will sign it for you. Is that right? Is that what you're saying, Jolyon? So yes, if you want to get it just now, you can get a signed copy.
Well, I've enjoyed our conversation very much. Thank you very much, and thank you for all those questions.